Deep in the Appalachian wilderness of 1801, where mountain fog conceals secrets and isolation breeds unthinkable horrors, there stood a remote farmstead that would become the center of one of America's most disturbing family crimes. The account I'm about to share began with Delilah McKenna, a widow revered throughout her small mountain community as a devoted mother raising 5 sons alone. But what investigators discovered behind the walls of her property revealed a truth so twisted that authorities buried the case files for decades. In a place where no screams could be heard and no neighbors could witness, a mother's twisted devotion transformed her own children into prisoners of her unspeakable desires. How did 5 grown men endure years of unimaginable control? What finally drove them to chain their own mother in the very barn where she committed her most heinous acts? And what evidence did Sheriff Crawford uncover that made seasoned lawmen refuse to speak of it for generations? The justice that followed was swift and final. Prepare yourself for what comes next, because this documented account will shatter everything you believe about maternal love. Subscribe and stand with us as we expose these buried truths. Comment your city and time. We love seeing where these stories reach. In the autumn of 1884, when the first frost painted the Appalachian peaks silver, Delilah McKenna stood beside her husband's grave with 5 sons ranging from 8 to 17 years old. The community of Millbrook Hollow gathered around the freshly turned earth, their voices rising in hymns that echoed off the mountain walls. What they witnessed that day was a woman they believed embodied Christian virtue, a devoted wife, now facing the impossible task of raising 5 boys alone in the harsh mountain wilderness. Church records from that period, preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society, document the outpouring of support for the McKenna family, with neighbors volunteering to help with farming and local merchants extending credit indefinitely. Reverend Isaiah Thompson's diary, discovered in 1943 during church renovations, reveals the first signs of what would later horrify investigators. Within weeks of her husband's burial, Delilah began visiting the Reverend's study with increasing frequency, seeking what she called biblical guidance for raising her sons. Thompson noted her particular obsession with Old Testament passages about bloodlines and the duty of sons to honor their mother above all earthly concerns. Her questions grew increasingly specific about biblical precedents for family isolation, with Delilah arguing that the outside world posed spiritual dangers to her boys that only a mother's protection could prevent. The Reverend's entries from December 1884 describe conversations that left him deeply unsettled. Delilah spoke of dreams where God commanded her to keep her sons pure from worldly corruption, dreams that became more vivid and detailed with each visit. She began quoting Scripture with a fervor that Thompson found disturbing, particularly passages about Sarah and Abraham, about the importance of continuing blessed bloodlines through any means necessary. When Thompson gently suggested that her interpretations might be unconventional, Delilah's demeanor shifted dramatically, her eyes taking on what he described as a zealot's fire that chilled my very soul. By spring of 1885, neighbors began noticing changes in the McKenna household that would later provide crucial testimony during the trial. Sarah Whitmore, whose property bordered the McKenna land, documented in letters to her sister how rarely the McKenna boys were seen in town anymore. The older sons, Thomas and Jacob, who had previously helped with community barn raisings and harvest festivals, simply vanished from public life. When Sarah inquired about their absence at the church social, Delilah explained that God had revealed to her the necessity of keeping her sons separate from the spiritual contamination of other families. The town's general store records, meticulously kept by proprietor Daniel Hayes, show a disturbing pattern in the McKenna family's purchasing habits during this period. Delilah's orders increasingly included medical supplies unusual for a farming family, large quantities of rope and metal chains supposedly for livestock, and an alarming amount of laudanum, which she claimed was for treating her son's various ailments. Hayes noted in his ledger margins that none of the McKenna boys appeared ill when he occasionally glimpsed them, yet their mother continued purchasing medicine in quantities that would stock a small infirmary. More disturbing still were the items Delilah special ordered through Hayes's catalog service, purchases that would later serve as damning evidence in court. Heavy padlocks, restraining devices marketed for unruly livestock, and medical instruments typically used by midwives arrived addressed to the McKenna farm throughout 1886 and 87. When Hayes questioned these unusual requests, Delilah explained that God was preparing her family for a special calling that required complete self-sufficiency and protection from outside interference. The first concrete evidence of Delilah's true intentions emerged in Sheriff Crawford's investigation years later when authorities discovered her private journals hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. The earliest entries, dated from late 1887, reveal a woman who had convinced herself that divine revelation justified the unthinkable. She wrote extensively about her oldest son Thomas, then 20 years old, describing him as the instrument through which God would establish a pure bloodline free from the corruption of outside breeding. Her handwriting, initially neat and controlled, grew increasingly erratic as she detailed her plans for ensuring this divine mandate would be fulfilled. The journal entries from 1888 document Delilah's systematic preparation for what she termed the Lord's work. She began modifying the barn, adding private stalls with locking mechanisms and medical equipment that would later horrify investigators. Her writing reveals meticulous planning, with detailed diagrams of how to restrain unwilling participants and medical notes about ensuring successful breeding outcomes. Most chilling were her calculations about timing, fertility cycles, and her plans for managing what she called the sacred offspring that would result from her twisted interpretation of biblical duty. Reverend Thompson's final diary entry regarding Delilah McKenna, dated March 18, 89, describes their last conversation before she stopped attending church services entirely. She had approached him after Sunday service with a strange light in her eyes, speaking about how God had shown her the path to ensuring her family's bloodline would remain pure until Christ's return. When Thompson expressed concern about her increasingly isolated lifestyle, Delilah smiled in a way that he described as utterly devoid of human warmth, and informed him that earthly religious institutions were no longer necessary for her family's salvation. The community's last glimpse of the McKenna sons as free individuals came during the harsh winter of 1889, when a blizzard forced several families to seek shelter at various farms throughout the valley. The Fletcher family, stranded near the McKenna property, would later testify that when they approached the farmhouse seeking refuge, they heard sounds from the barn that defied explanation, a mixture of crying and what sounded like chains rattling. Delilah met them at the door with a shotgun, claiming that her boys were all desperately ill with a contagious fever and that no outsiders could be permitted on the property for fear of spreading the sickness. By 1890, the McKenna farm had become a fortress of isolation that would hide unspeakable horrors for the next decade. Delilah's transformation from grieving widow to something far more sinister was complete, though the outside world remained ignorant of the truth festering behind the walls of what neighbors still believed to be a house of mourning. The stage was set for crimes that would shock even the most hardened investigators when the truth finally emerged. The first documented evidence of Delilah's horrific plan being implemented appears in her personal ledger, discovered during the 1801 raid by Sheriff Crawford's deputies. The entry, dated September 15, 1890, records in clinical detail the first forced breeding between her eldest son, Thomas, and a young woman Delilah had lured to the farm under false pretenses. Her handwriting, now completely erratic, describes this event as the blessed beginning of God's pure lineage, marking the start of a reign of terror that would continue for over a decade until her sons finally found the courage to chain the monster their mother had become. Sheriff William Crawford first noticed the pattern in late 1895, when the third young woman in 6 months disappeared without explanation from the mountain communities surrounding Millbrook Hollow. His official reports, preserved in the county courthouse archives, document a methodical investigation that would eventually expose the full horror of Delilah McKenna's operation. Martha Henderson, age 19, had vanished while traveling to visit relatives in the next valley, her horse found wandering riderless near the McKenna property line. When Crawford questioned Delilah about any strangers passing through, she claimed to have seen nothing unusual, her demeanor so composed it struck him as rehearsed. The sheriff's suspicions deepened when he discovered that all 3 missing women shared specific characteristics that would later prove significant during the trial. Each was young, healthy, and from families with limited means to conduct extensive searches when they disappeared. Crawford's investigation notes reveal his growing certainty that these disappearances were connected, though he lacked the evidence to support his theory. His interviews with local families painted a disturbing picture of young women who had simply vanished from well-traveled roads, leaving behind only their belongings and horses that invariably wandered toward the McKenna farm. The breakthrough came in spring of 1896 when Crawford received an anonymous letter that would change everything. Written in a shaky hand and delivered under cover of darkness, the message claimed that screams could be heard from the McKenna barn during certain nights of the month, always coinciding with the lunar cycle. The letter writer, later identified as neighbor Samuel Briggs during the trial, described sounds that haunted his dreams, a mixture of female voices crying for help and what sounded like chains dragging across wooden floors. Crawford filed the letter as evidence, though he knew that anonymous testimony alone would never convince a judge to issue a search warrant. The sheriff's persistence finally yielded results when he began monitoring the McKenna property from a distance, documenting unusual activity patterns that formed the basis of his eventual case. His observation logs, meticulously kept throughout 1897, record strange lights burning in the barn well past midnight, the arrival of supply wagons at odd hours, and, most disturbing of all, glimpses of figures moving between the barn and house under cover of darkness. Crawford noted that these nocturnal activities followed a precise schedule, occurring approximately every 4 weeks with clockwork regularity that suggested careful planning, rather than random events. The first concrete evidence of Delilah's crimes surfaced when Crawford discovered the abandoned campsite of Rebecca Morrison, the 4th missing woman, hidden in a ravine less than a mile from the McKenna farm. Her belongings told a story of violent struggle, with torn clothing, scattered personal items, and most significantly, a torn piece of paper bearing Delilah's handwriting offering employment as a domestic servant. Crawford's report describes finding rope burns on tree branches where someone had clearly been restrained, along with disturbing stains on the ground that laboratory analysis would later confirm as human blood. Armed with this physical evidence, Crawford finally obtained a limited search warrant in autumn of 1897, though Delilah's political connections in the county seat ensured the search would be restricted to the property's perimeter buildings only. What he discovered in the barn's outer chambers provided the first glimpse into a systematic operation that defied comprehension. Hidden beneath hay bales, Crawford found detailed medical records documenting pregnancies, births, and what Delilah clinically referred to as breeding outcomes, for women identified only by initials and physical descriptions that match the missing persons reports. The records, written in Delilah's increasingly erratic handwriting, revealed a woman who viewed human beings as livestock to be managed and controlled for optimal reproductive results. Her notes included detailed fertility charts, dietary plans designed to ensure healthy pregnancies, and most chilling of all, disposal methods for what she termed failed experiments. Crawford's hands shook as he read entries describing the systematic rape of captive women by Delilah's sons, events orchestrated and documented with the cold precision of a livestock breeder managing prize cattle. More damning still were the financial records Crawford discovered alongside the breeding documentation, showing that Delilah had been selling the resulting children to childless couples throughout the region for substantial sums. Her ledger recorded transactions spanning nearly 7 years, with buyers identified by coded initials and payment amounts that suggested a thriving underground market in human trafficking. The sheriff's report notes his horror at realizing that dozens of children born from unspeakable crimes were now living with families who believed they had participated in legitimate adoptions. The discovery that would ultimately seal Delilah's fate came when Crawford found the escape tunnel, partially collapsed, but still containing evidence of the McKenna sons' desperate attempts to flee their mother's control. Hidden beneath the barn floor, the crude excavation stretched nearly 50 feet toward the property line, its walls bearing scratch marks from fingernails and fragments of chain links where the brothers had attempted to free themselves from their restraints. Crawford's crime scene notes describe finding blood on the tunnel walls and scraps of clothing that suggested multiple failed escape attempts over several years. The most damning evidence emerged when Crawford discovered Delilah's private correspondence with buyers, letters that revealed the full scope of her operation and provided the proof needed for prosecution. Her communications, hidden in a waterproof box buried near the barn, demonstrated clear premeditation and business-like efficiency in managing what she had transformed into a profitable criminal enterprise. The letters discussed delivery schedules, payment terms, and quality guarantees that treated human children as commercial products, written in language that revealed a complete absence of moral recognition regarding her crimes. The final piece of Crawford's puzzle fell into place when he intercepted a delivery wagon approaching the McKenna farm in December 1898, discovering 2 more young women bound and drugged in the cargo area. The wagon driver, when confronted, immediately confessed to his role in Delilah's operation, revealing a network of accomplices throughout the mountain region who helped identify and capture suitable victims. His sworn statement, recorded in Crawford's official files, described Delilah as the undisputed leader of an organization that had been operating with impunity for nearly a decade. Crawford's investigation notes from early 1899 document his growing urgency as he realized that Delilah had become aware of his surveillance and was accelerating her operations accordingly. Her recent victims showed signs of increasingly desperate treatment, suggesting that she knew her time was running short and was attempting to maximize profits before inevitable exposure. The sheriff's reports describe a woman who had abandoned all pretense of concealment, operating with the reckless confidence of someone who believed herself beyond the reach of earthly justice. The breakthrough that would finally bring Delilah McKenna to justice came when Crawford managed to intercept one of her breeding ledgers being transported to a secure location, revealing not only the full extent of her crimes, but also the locations where evidence had been hidden throughout the property. The detailed maps and inventory lists contained within this document would guide the massive raid that would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening behind the walls of the McKenna farm, bringing an end to a reign of terror that had claimed dozens of victims over more than a decade. The raid on the McKenna property commenced at dawn on March 15, 1899, when Sheriff Crawford and 6 deputies surrounded the isolated farmstead with warrants authorizing a complete search of all buildings and grounds. The official police report, filed that evening and preserved in the county archives, describes what investigators discovered as scenes of depravity that challenged the bounds of human comprehension. Crawford's first glimpse inside the barn revealed a structure that had been systematically converted into what could only be described as a human breeding facility, complete with individual stalls, medical equipment, and restraining devices that defied any innocent explanation. The barn's interior had been divided into 8 separate compartments, each equipped with heavy chains bolted to the walls and straw bedding stained with substances that later laboratory analysis confirmed as blood, human waste, and bodily fluids. Crawford's crime scene notes describe finding iron shackles specifically sized for human ankles and wrists, some still bearing fragments of skin and hair that would later provide crucial DNA evidence during the trial. Most disturbing were the medical instruments scattered throughout each stall, including primitive surgical tools, birthing equipment, and syringes containing substances that field tests identified as sedatives strong enough to incapacitate a grown adult. The central area of the barn contained what Delilah had referred to in her records as the examination table, a crude wooden platform surrounded by medical charts detailing female anatomy, fertility cycles, and pregnancy progression. Deputy Marshal James Patterson, in his sworn testimony, described finding leather restraints still attached to this table, worn smooth from repeated use and bearing stains that forensic analysis would later confirm as human blood. Hanging above this nightmarish apparatus were detailed breeding charts tracking the menstrual cycles, sexual encounters, and pregnancy outcomes of women identified only by numbers, creating a clinical record of systematic sexual slavery that had operated for over a decade. The most damning physical evidence came from Delilah's private office, a locked room within the barn that served as the administrative center of her criminal operation.